of Automation and Artificial Intelligence, featuring panelists Ginny Rometty, Ivanka Trump, Doug McMillon, and moderator Andrew McAfee.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're here to talk about jobs and skills and artificial intelligence and automation and American innovation. The good news is we have 40 minutes. The better news is that we have three of the absolute best panelists that I could think of for this to help us. Doug, as the token male on the planet, on the panel, could I start with you?
Planet.
That was a Freudian slip. We hear a lot about a skills gap these days, this pretty serious imbalance between what companies need and what job candidates are showing up with. Is that skills gap real at Walmart? And if so, what can we do to close it?
It is real. In our case, we've got around the world 2.2 million people that work for the company. In the US, 1.6 million people. And
wow.
So we've got all kinds of jobs and all kinds of people that are joining the company. And the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is what's happening at store level. And as a company over the last few years, we've been taking a number of steps to close that gap. One of them is to create training academies around the country in 200 locations. Ivanka came to one recently in Texas, where we have classrooms, well-equipped, today's state-of-the-art equipment, including VR training, to teach people not only skills related to retail, but soft skills. We have an English as a second language program, but we also have things like how to do an evaluation, how to interview someone that comes, how to have a difficult conversation if you're a supervisor. So we're teaching them basic skills around retail, but also skills like that.
Isn't teaching basic skills kind of the job of the educational system?
Yeah, if they'll do that, we'll go on to do other things. But in the meantime, we got to help if we need to. And as I mentioned to you just a minute ago, I frequently think of the Walmart system as a ladder. And we've got an entry level, and we try to create well-spaced rungs on that ladder so that you can climb all the way up to the top of the company.
And what are your thoughts about why the educational system is not teeing up great, fully prepared candidates for you?
I think what Randall said earlier comes to mind. I think a lot of change needs to happen everywhere. Change is happening in business, change is happening in government, change has got to happen in the education system. And I think there's an opportunity, given today's technology and the leadership that exists in the country, including Ivanka leaning in on this issue, to pivot and get to a place where we can do a better job collaborating between parents, teachers, community college, vocational programs, in addition to 2- and 4-year degrees.
Ginny, does this all sound right to you? I know you have a particular passion around skills training and retraining.
Yes, well, actually, the three of us have this passion and have been working on this, and I think it gets to the heart of what you said, which is that in this world of technology, which is going to change 100% of jobs, and you've got to get your head around that. And it does mean two things. We have a large retraining job to do, and as well, you cannot have only one path to success, meaning a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree. And so in our country, we've got to provide ways, which we can talk about, of how to do this.
And we've gone pretty far down this path in America of kind of saying there's one path to career success, which is go get a good old-fashioned college education.
That's right.
Have we gone too far down that path?
I think we have gone too far, and I've had a big experience in this, in that we all have open jobs. There's 7 million open jobs in the country, of which 7 million at least people to apply who don't have the skills. That tells you an answer right there. It also tells you that we've spent $185 billion a year in higher education, and only a third of American working population has a bachelor's degree. Only a third after all that. So one of the things that we've looked at to say, especially with the technology, what about this new idea originally, and Ivanka knows she's helped a lot. I'm going to pivot back to some legislation she's helped with, which said, it's not blue-collar jobs, it's not white-collar jobs. We have this idea of a new collar. So what about high school plus a high school and associate degree, a 6-year high school, call it that. And just as Doug had mentioned, Ivanka visited theirs, we visited some schools together we've started that were called Pathway to Technology schools, 6-year high school. And so you get a high school degree, an associate degree at the same time, and a well above median paying job. And we've all, as employers, got to open up what we're going to hire, because we found they can do cybersecurity, they can do design, they can do programming. In the middle of the country, my big centers, and I have almost 400,000 people, in the middle of 20% now are these new collar hires that are not university degrees. And so whether it's veterans or out of school, and so this point about that we have got to provide another path for people to have and work in this new era of technology, because everybody will work with technology. And we'll get to this, I hope, a little later. There's a big BRT agenda about driving that. But I want to, just one last, to Ivanka, one of the most important things she really helped us do, there was something called the Perkins Act, one of the very first pieces of legislation we worked on, which said if you're a community college, you have got to teach a curriculum that's in demand in the market. And so that probably makes common sense to all of us. And this legislation said, okay, you don't get your funding unless you really do that. So it was legislation that you want your funding, you must teach curriculum aligned with supply and demand. Yeah. And so with her help, really, we've worked on it years, helped get that over the line, and that all fuels and lathers up to this idea that you can actually have, I think we can business public-private partnership. To Doug's point, it won't be solved without public-private partnership. You cannot rest this on the government alone to do this.
And Ivanka, you and I both have some economics training, I think. We kind of think that markets align supply and demand naturally very, very well. Why is there this big mismatch in this critically important area of education?
Well, I think first of all, and to echo some of what Doug and Ginny said, we are at this moment, this turning point where there is so much change and it's happening so rapidly that you can't rely on just the federal government or state and local governments or the private sector alone. And we fundamentally have to rethink human potential and rethink it not just K through 12, but this term lifelong learning is almost a cliche that people throw out, but what does it actually mean and how are we actually going to accomplish that? How do we think about and ensure that a third grade student knows how to read, that somebody graduating from a university is graduating with a marketable skill, because we know they'll be graduating with debt in most cases. We have 1.5 trillion of it. And how do we also ensure that there are multiple pathways to family-sustaining careers? These alternatives that used to be prioritized in this country and now have somehow been delegitimized in favor of college. Now, college is amazing, very important. We wouldn't want to discourage people from doing that when it's right for them. But there are also apprenticeships, there are credentials, there are badges. There are so many opportunities today that are vacant that don't require a college education. And we need to make people aware of the array of options. So some of the things we are doing at the federal government, obviously championing legislation that helps us accomplish this goal, the reauthorization of Perkins Career and Technical Education. That will benefit 11 million students and workers across the country. And really this needed to happen because we needed to make sure that this money being block granted to the states was being used to educate students and workers with jobs that are actually in demand within those local communities, so to create a stronger connection between the educators and the private sector. We also created something called the National Council for the American Worker. And this is a US government council. It's across 14 different agencies, and it's let's come together and come up with a strategic vision for how we think about education at all stages of one's career. Now, the federal government spends a lot of money on worker training program, and truthfully, the best stuff we've seen is not that. It's happening at a state level. It's where a governor or a local leader teams up with a business, teams up with a community college, they co-develop a curriculum, they teach it to the students, and employ them on the opposite end. So there are a lot of great things happening out on a state level, but what the federal government can do is we can convene, we can create best practices, we can free up data. We have so much data that will allow the private sector to come and innovate and bridge that skills gap, because I think one of the reasons there is a skills gap is because there isn't transparency around job vacancies. So right now, we can tell you that for the first time in history, there are more vacant jobs than people available to fill them. We can tell you what industries they're in based on Bureau of Labor Statistics data, but we can't tell you geographically where they're located, and we can't tell you the underlying skills required to fill them. So
Because we just
It's
don't
in
have
mining and logging.
We just
but
don't
what
have
does
that
that mean?
information right now?
That's, well, and we're not, so some of the great examples of what government's done in the past is make data available, and then the private sector comes in and does what they do best. So a great example of this is all of our weather apps. That's innovation off of government data to specific users based on what their needs are.
Yeah.
We need to do that around jobs and around skills. So we're really passionate about thinking about how we can leverage government data, how we can encourage private sector, large employers to contribute their data, create a national schema, create language that is uniform so it's searchable. So if somebody has a skill, they can know the 10 other industries that that skill would make them successful in.
Okay.
That information is not currently available. There's also, I think, a big opportunity, which Ginny touched on, in terms of higher education reauthorization, which is coming up next year, and ways that we can take away sort of the disincentive to go other routes than four-year college, open up Pell Grants, for example, to people getting dual degrees or in high school or going on to apprenticeship programs. We've created industry-wide apprenticeship programs at the federal government, which we think is a tremendous opportunity, taking the lead of countries like Switzerland and Germany who have done this successfully. And then, and both of your companies have signed it, we've created a pledge that is really a private sector pledge. It's called our Pledge to America's Workers, that since we launched it just 3 months ago, over 6.5 million enhanced career opportunities have been created by the private sector. And this is a way we can hopefully excite the private sector to join us, companies large and small, to invest into their workforce. Because while we hear there are job vacancies, we hear from employers all the time that they don't have workers with the skills they need, but what role are they taking in training those workers, in upskilling those workers, and ensuring that they maintain their path in the face of automation?
Can I ask Ivanka one follow-up question?
Yeah.
One of the demographic groups that seems to be having the most trouble with this big adjustment that we all agree is happening is essentially mid-career, middle-aged, least educated Americans. We were talking backstage about the people on the sidelines of the economy, just not even looking for jobs anymore. This is the group that is really most on the sidelines. Have you seen green shoots about what needs to happen to get those folk off the sidelines?
Oh, absolutely. And this is why I'm so passionate about this now, because the economy is so strong.
Yeah.
Because unemployment is so low, that means that companies are investing in those that are on the sidelines, teaching them the skills. They're investing in those that would otherwise not be given the opportunity. For example, we have 650,000 people come out of our federal and state prisons every year. Okay. Those people would not be given an opportunity if the unemployment rate was at 8%. Yeah. But now they are getting that opportunity. So how can we, as part of the First Step Act, which we're seeking to have passed in the coming weeks, how can we think about using our prison system so that we can teach those in custody skills that will allow them to come out, get jobs, and have an opportunity. What's fascinating to me is a full 1/3 of the people who are currently unemployed just were added to the figures of unemployment, meaning they came out
exactly.
They came into the economy.
At least
started
they came into
looking
the
for,
game.
Correct.
Yep.
They had, for whatever reason, stopped looking and they started looking. And that's amazing.
It's a great phenomenon, right? Should we be worried, for example, about the 3 million-ish people who drive vehicles for a living in the face of autonomous cars and trucks?
Well, this is why we need this combination between the public and the private sector, because the private sector will always know before us which jobs are going to be displaced. And this is why I'm so passionate about creating this national call to action of what is your role. Everyone wants to be a good corporate citizen. That's taken on a different level of priority in recent years than it had probably in decades prior. But I view the first place you start is the workforce and your workforce. So what is the role of companies as they're making investment in technology that will also create opportunity? So when you think about what's happening in factories, making work less dangerous by working with robotics is going to enable people to be more productive. It's going to hopefully decrease the amount of injuries. For manual labor, it's going to allow people with disabilities, more women women to come into the workforce and do jobs that were traditionally male jobs. So there's tremendous opportunity, but we need the feedback from the private sector. And then our job as government, once we convene, is to make sure that we're A, raising awareness, and B, providing these alternative pathways.
And I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, I wanted to just build on this because in this being the BRT here coming together and its agenda, and the supply and demand here. So one of the things we do really recognize, all of us, that with 100% of jobs changing, this reskilling of America in lifelong learning, what do you do? So there's part of a program we're now launching as part of this innovation called, if you take a look, think of it as being ready, right? So Tomorrow Ready, a program Tomorrow Ready, an America that always learns. And where this matches up is that you say, it is a job of all of us to help do that reskilling. And so there are mechanisms, policy things that can be done. Ivanka mentioned the Higher Education Act up for reauthorization. There is $100 billion on loans, there's $30 billion on grants, and then there is work-study programs. Okay. Changes such as, for work-study, allow that to be an apprenticeship out in the marketplace, not working on campus.
Which is not the case
so
now?
not working on, no, it is not.
Great.
You have to use that money, almost all but 25% of it, to work on campus.
Oh, to sit in a
So kids
classroom.
are in a cafeteria getting paid, or they're sweeping floors. So that's a work-study funding.
Got it.
Then when it comes to grants and loans, today you have to be a full-time student, or you've got to be full-time and going to college. Well, instead, what if we use some of that money and broaden the base of where that goes? So you were asking about all those people to be retrained.
Yeah.
Apprenticeships, badges, credentials, and all that could help quickly go against that.
So we couldn't be too rigid or too constrained with some of what
we are going to propose, and hopefully with Ivanka's help again and others, to change some of that policy to do it. Because then I want to come back to the other part is Doug and all of us in private sector, the demand. So we have to be willing then to hire people from all these walks of life. And so that would mean, and I was telling Andrew backstage, I've done this study as part of a cybersecurity study we're hosting as part of the Aspen Institute. And we looked at for the whole country, because everybody needs cybersecurity people. And we took everybody's job applications in the whole country and did the analysis on them. All of us employers are writing down 3x the qualifications than you really need to do those jobs. You ask for all these credentials, all these years of experience, which frankly are probably almost impossible to fill. So
there are 7 people in the country with all those credentials.
But it's an example of almost every technology-related job is getting over-specced out there. So if we can get employers to say, no, let me write what I really need, and using tools, AI, the person actually can handle that job, and they don't need that university degree. And therefore, the demand side, us, we need to be willing to hire in those folks.
Can you give us any insight as to why employers like yourselves tend to over-credential so much?
Oh, it's not just me, by the way. It's all of us. It's all of us, so just to be clear.
Like, Doug, if you can, why would you do that?
Many things technology-related. People often put, you've got to have this kind of degree, this kind of this computer science. And when you look around, if every job's going to have tech intermixed with it, you're a bank teller, right? You're working in any kind of retail. You actually can get these credentials in other ways. And so I really think it's just, you get to, it's such an important piece of both the employer changing their mindset and then putting these enablers in the education system out there.
One way to think about it is to deconstruct the job itself or the job title and code down to tasks.
Yep.
And think about where can AI help me or some other form of automation help me, and therefore what's left and what are humans best at, and how do you pivot them, prepare them, and train them to do the things that we are better at.
Yeah, got it.
I think one of the other elements that is important to consider as part of this conversation is that when you look at the country, there's a real diversity in the poverty that exists and in the opportunity that exists. And I think one of the things that we've done through tax reform is not only make our country and our businesses more competitive, while on the same time, on the same side of the coin, investing in working families, but we've also created something called opportunity zones. And these are, I think, going to be really transformative, because how do you drive investment? How do you encourage private sector capital to go to urban and rural underserved communities across this country where the unemployment rates are disproportionately high.
Yes.
So I think once the demand's there, and once the capital's there, and once the businesses are located there, then there'll be the training opportunity, there'll be the employment opportunity. So I actually think that's a big part of the problem as well, that there are certain areas, there's certain geographic areas of this country that have just not had the same access to opportunity. And therefore, from a skills perspective, they've been left behind.
It is
spent a lot
encouraging to
of
see
time.
how tech jobs are starting to spread out
Yeah,
around the company.
You're seeing
I
that
was
as
You
well.
can see coding happening in all kinds of places these days.
I was in Eastern Kentucky recently, and I met a gentleman named Alex, and he was telling me how a couple of years ago he applied multiple times at local grocery stores to bag groceries and was turned down for a job. Then he took a class in coding and computer science, and now he gets at least one email a week soliciting him to work for their firm, big firms that we know about, computer science firms and other firms, to join their company. And he lives in Eastern Kentucky, has no interest in moving. Code is exportable, just like coal. So just I think for employers also to get more creative about the talent that exists outside of the country. I think for venture capital to leave 3/4 of venture capital is located in 3 states, which is crazy. So how do we encourage that capital to invest in other communities? And I think opportunity zones will be a major catalyst in terms of spurring that type of investment.
And is the White House open to more kinds of place-based, specifically geographically targeted policies? Employment opportunity zones are a great one. There could be wage subsidies for workers. There
what's
could be
interesting-
entrepreneur visas.
I think what's interesting about opportunity zones, it creates the incentive for the private sector to go to areas that have been overlooked, rather than us picking and choosing. I think another area that we've been very focused on is working family policies that recognize the modern reality where 47% of the workforce is female. In 40% of American households, females are the primary breadwinners, yet women disproportionately provide unpaid care for adult dependents and for our children. So how do we adapt to that new reality? Because it's actually happened quite quickly over recent decades. How do we advance policies like paid leave? And this president was the first to put a national paid leave plan in the president's budget every single year. Now we're working to build coalitions of support for legislation on that front. As part of tax reform, doubling the child tax credit, recognizing that it's expensive to raise children. And just like in business, if you invest in technology, you write off that expense. Well, what about parents investing in our future workforce? So we're between that and then, of course, childcare, which is an enormous problem in this country. In the most recent omnibus, we had the single largest expansion of the childcare and development block grants to the states, recognizing that you can't work if you can't afford care. And I heard this from the employees at Walmart, and it's been amazing to see, Doug, what you've done in terms of expanding benefits such as paid leave to your workers, but hearing some of the challenges around childcare access, childcare affordability, that is a real restriction to growth, and
So
both the
should we
private
become-
sector and public sector needs to think about it.
We took a portion of the tax savings and lengthened our benefits to 16 weeks for birth moms, parental leave up to 10 weeks, and it was one of the most popular things we've done this year.
Doug, I had a really interesting experience just a couple weeks ago. I walked into a convenience store, grabbed a couple items off the shelf, walked out of that store, and instead of getting arrested for shoplifting, I got a receipt saying, oh, you bought these couple things. Is that the future of retail?
Yeah, for sure. There's innovation happening at the front of the store and the middle of the store, the back, and in the supply chain. It's happening in terms of robotics and automation. Today at Sam's Club, you can use Scan and Go and do exactly what you just experienced.
I didn't even
at the convenience
scan.
store. Well, then you may need to be arrested. No, just kidding.
I stand here before you.
It was probably computer vision. It's happening here. It's happening in China. In our stores today, in some of our test stores, we've got autonomous floor cleaners. Think of an industrial Roomba wandering around the store, and it's got a camera on it. It's looking at all of the features that we have in the store. Another scanner's running an aisle. They're talking to each other. They're also talking to an unloader in the back, where there's a camera that's looking at the rollers with the freight coming out of the back of the trailer, and it's sorting. This needs to go to the floor right now. IoT is starting to happen, and as we datafy all of the transactions inside the company, not just our transactions with customers, but internal transactions, and then start to apply smarter and smarter algorithms to that, you're going to see a lot of change happen. 5G,
those examples,
cloud, all of this is coming together to create
those examples you just gave sound to me like labor replacing technologies as opposed to labor augmenting technologies. What am I missing?
No, partially you're right. I think what's happening, as I've talked with store associates and DC associates, is that those tasks that they didn't enjoy doing very much, that were mundane or difficult in some way, the machines are starting to do them. And people like it. So we're ending up just upgrading them to do things, upskilling them, and that's one of the reasons why we need the academies, is to prepare them to do different kinds of work. So at the same time that's happening, and as cashier counts are coming down, personal shoppers are being created where we pick your grocery order for you. So one of the more popular things we've got right now is grocery pickup, where you can order on your app and schedule a slot and come through the store and pick it up. We'll put it in your trunk and you take off. Well, already we've created 30,000 jobs for people that are picking orders inside of our stores as they become fulfillment centers. And now delivery's growing, and we hope to use associates to do home deliveries as well. So there'll be a pivot to new kinds of jobs.
One of the greatest things that I saw when I was at a Walmart Academy in Mesquite, Texas, was because of the efficiencies that you're talking about that technology has enabled, it actually freed up bandwidth within the footprint of existing stores that enabled you to create these academies and use that space to upskill your existing workforce and really invest in that workforce for different type of opportunities. And that's where the soft skills component is so important. Conflict resolution. How do you deal with a customer when tensions are flaring. There was a simulation, which I'm glad I didn't have to experience, but how do you deal with the Thanksgiving Day bombardment, where people are pulling toys off the shelf and fighting over, like, what do you do in a high intensity situation like that? So to be able to actually simulate those type of experiences is absolutely amazing. So I saw some of the VR technology and I was blown away by it. But I think that's a great example of the continued investment. And now that's not called a new job, but I actually view that as just as important as creating a new job opportunity, an apprenticeship, or going into a high school and giving somebody a pathway right out of high school, but investing in an existing worker and giving them a pathway for growth.
Ivanka put on VR goggles and stalked a vegetable wall in front of about 100 Walmart.
How did she handle the onslaught of Black Friday shoppers? Was she a pro?
She was great. Yeah,
Unflappable.
we'll put a badge on her anytime.
I took off the mask, threw it down, and ran.
Ginny, you know that for the entire industrial era, there has been hand-wringing and worrying about massive unemployment because of technology. Yes. For 200 years, that has been wrong. Yeah. As I've listened to you, you seem confident that that hand-wringing or that worry is going to continue to be wrong, to be misplaced, that we're going to have a more jobs future, even in the face of all this technology. Do I have that right?
I do. And I do think that, as I've said, there were so many studies, and there are many fear-mongering about this topic, but that in the end, what is true is that 100% of jobs, they will change. They will change in some way. You were just describing how even the person who does and deals with a customer in the store, what they do is different today. So if you wrap your head around that, it is what makes skills the issue of our time. That's why we keep going back to what we all have to do. And what's different though now, and we do work with you guys quite a bit as Walmart, but this speed of how this is happening, it is happening more quickly than in the past, which is what's making the skills an urgent issue. But it also means something else for these technologies like AI. It is our job to be sure they're brought safely into this world. So I do think, Andrew, there's a set of things that business owes a responsibility, all business, not just tech, to bring them safely in. So that means, Doug was just describing how a person interacts with the technology. So I think one of the principles you should live by is, we believe that these technologies should augment what man does. I mean, I build them. I have a chance to influence that. And so therefore, how I build them, you're right, they're going to replace things that are common sense. It's going to be replaced and more. So therefore, it's going to force each of us to do what man does well. And therefore, I build it that way. So that's purpose. I think it's going to still bring a light on who owns data, how should it be used, where does the benefit go. I have to be a believer that data goes and belongs to the owner, and so do the insights. And then the next is something these guys are both alluding to. These technologies, they got to be explainable so the population trusts them. Mm-hmm. And that also means, by the way, like AI, it's taught, as you well know, and therefore it can learn bias. So it is really important that we have diverse workforces that train these things, that we use tools that make them not biased, or we repeat the sins of our past.
A monoculture developing AI is
it's a horrible
a bad
thing.
idea.
It really, these discussions about getting such a inclusive working culture, it is critical to our future. Building our toys, building our games, building our work, you want diverse workforces, but my point on that is that you want society to trust these things, right? And so I'm one of my best examples, one of the big banks we work with in Europe that uses AI with all their customer service, as many banks and more are starting to do. The union is 100% supportive. The union is, right? Now you typically think, oh, that means there's gonna be less jobs. No, you know what? Everybody wants to do a good job at their work. The customer service people, very complex financial products, all feel they can now do a better job because they have an assistant helping them with the things they're not always sure of. You know, we like to think humans are always right. You know the number. I mean, humans are not right all the time, right? Nor is your doctor, nor is anyone. And so, in fact, a third. And so people feel so much better about their job. They can get more done, their education
when they're
level.
backstopped by some good technology.
Yes, and so, and again, will there be things replaced? Yes, but when I look at the amount of customer service that people can now do a better job at, some will be replaced, absolutely. When I look at healthcare and I watch an oncology, diagnosis and treatment be done better, these are really big issues. Yeah. Almost like any important life decision is going to have some of that help in there, and that's how I think you have to think of it, as augmenting what we do. And
I'm an optimist in this regard as well.
I am very much.
We just left a great working group discussion at the White House where we're talking as a collective with leaders in industry and academia about how we can ensure America's dominance in industries of the future. Specifically, we were talking about AI, robotics, advanced manufacturing, 5G technology, and quantum. And you think about something like quantum, for example, we are so early. The number of jobs that are created, we can't even envision the industries that will be built. You know, there's always the famous example about the advent of the ATM machine and the fear that it would put bankers and tellers out of business. Well, they gravitated into new and different and ultimately more fulfilling jobs. And the industry has exploded in terms of the number of employees. So
we actually are past peak bank teller in the U.S. though. The number of jobs is going down now.
Oh yeah.
We finally got there.
We're finally moving
it took a while, right?
But I think that we will, innovation, I believe, is always a net positive, but there will be disruption, and it's our job to ensure the smoothest and the swiftest transition for those that are affected. And those that are affected, those that are most vulnerable, are those with the least amount of skills. When you think about the fact that as a society, both the federal government, but also the private sector, spends less on workforce development after the age of 22 than any country in the developed world other than Mexico. Less. So we are making all of our investment in terms of skills training as a country historically. We've been making it in those with specialized degrees or graduate degrees, but we're not investing in the worker that's the most vulnerable, and that's what we need to change, the private sector and the government.
This gets to a great question that we got from the audience, which, Doug, I want to throw to you exactly to this point. The question says there's a lot of concern about the growing divide between rural and urban America. How do we help individuals in rural America take advantage of these phenomena that we're talking about? You're a huge employer in exactly these communities that are being left behind. What would help most?
That very much relates to the point that Ivanka just made about disruption. We are going to go through a period of greater disruption, and as leaders, we have a responsibility to communicate, explain to everyone what is happening and what the path is for them to work their way through it, for them and their family. So here is the open door. Here's the opportunity for you to step through, and if you'll take these training courses, expose yourself in this manner to learning something new, actually being a curious lifelong learner for as many people as possible, then I think we can help lead people through this change. But it's going to take communication, it's going to take training programs, it's going to take investment. We just created this opportunity with Guild to do college education for basically $1 a day, working with a small group of universities, including the University of Florida. And so far in our own training academies, we've been able to have about $210 million worth of portable education that they can now take towards a 2-year and 4-year degree. I think all of these pieces have got to be put in place, and then we need to explain to everyone, here's what's happening, here's the opportunity for you, and as a private sector player in this equation, we can really help make this transition happen, but we do have to all work together.
Yeah,
What
that's what I was
grade
going to
would-
Prioritize.
Let me ask one quick final. What grade would you give us so far as a public-private partnership at doing exactly what you said?
A D.
Wow.
I think we got a lot of opportunity, and there's a lot of change coming. As Jenny said earlier, virtually every job is going to change, and we're on the front end of this. These technologies that Ivanka mentioned just a minute ago are going to bring more change in the next 5 years and 10 years. These are not things that are 20 years from now. That's much greater than the change we've seen in the last 5.
Are
So
you
we
as
need
harsh
to
a
come
grader
together
as
and
Doug?
step
No,
up.
well, I'm not quite as harsh a grader, but I do think that it is not an issue of will. It is an issue of organization and
Yes.
scale.
Yeah.
Because we are watching this already, and this is partly why we've all been so active in the BRT. You can't have a country with all the skills on two sides. You cannot do that. And so therefore, the whole middle of our country, as we go build these, and you go, 500 companies, if we start, instead of doing individual efforts, which is what we've been trying to do, is now aggregate these efforts so we can scale them. And as an example with these schools, 500 companies have pulled these high schools, underprivileged areas, and gone to the most underprivileged in the middle of the country, 200 high schools, a pipeline of 125,000 kids now coming through in those areas. That's why I feel maybe it's a D of what's been accomplished at the moment, but what we can accomplish, I know we all have high confidence.
Yeah, let's talk about this a little bit more. I mean, I think we are, as leaders, seeing things and understanding things and starting to put things in place. But if you look at what's happening in the country, how people feel, the divide they feel, populism, things,
We have to do
they're uncomfortable. Will my child's future be better than mine? Am I going to be okay? They don't know the answers, the solutions. They just have concerns and questions too often. I'm talking about middle America in particular.
I agree.
We've got to help lead them through that process.
And I think the communications element is incredibly important because, of course, if you're in an industry that's constantly being talked about as an industry that's going to be automated within the next decade, how could you not feel tremendous anxiety? And that anxiety permeates communities. And so I think a big part of this is communicating what our strategy is. And that's why creating a national council for the American worker for the first time that takes this all of government approach to say it's our obligation to be thinking about skills development, vocational education, lifelong learning from birth through retirement, and work with the private sector to do the things we don't do as well, doing specific job training for specific jobs, but then help take our data and scale it, even at the federal government. You think about something like cybersecurity jobs. Well, it's really hard to fill a cybersecurity job anywhere, in any industry, including in the federal government. We have the country's largest workforce. Doug is small, a little bit of the largest private employer. So the combination of that, but what skills do we have, clerical skills that we think will become obsolete over time, and can we start to begin to reskill those workers in the federal workforce with skills in cyber that we so desperately need? So we've launched a GEAR Challenge. We're working with the private sector to do that using our own workforce and trying to lead by example on this front.
Ivanka, even among friends, there can be disagreements. And the Business Roundtable sent the White House a letter in August of this year saying that some of the immigration policies that were in place or were being contemplated were not only bad for the people involved, but were bad for business among the Business Roundtable companies. How was that letter received?
Well, I think that generally speaking, we need to overhaul immigration and ensure that we're able to have a merit-based system where we're able to bring people into this country to fill jobs that can't otherwise be filled by Americans. But I view these as complementary discussions, but it's not an either or. We still have to be thinking about the 6+ million unemployed Americans. We still have to be thinking about the fact that for a developed nation, we have a pretty low labor force participation rate of able-bodied Americans who, for reasons such as addiction to opioids or other reasons, are outside of the system. So I don't view them as, I view them as important to be conversations to have in tandem. But we have an existing population of workers we need to make sure are prepared, and then we obviously have to supplement that with thoughtful immigration reforms that enable us to attract the best talent to this country and then keep that talent within the country. For example, after receiving an education, we want people to start their businesses in the United States, not move to start them elsewhere.
We're almost out of time, so a lightning round final question for each
Plus
of you.
access to market, sorry, because we spoke about this today. It's
we
really,
did.
really important. But the president's negotiations on trade and creating greater access for American companies to foreign markets and leveling the playing field is critical, because that's going to create growth, that's going to create jobs, that's going to create opportunities here domestically.
And with that, we don't have time for my lightning round final question, which is a darn shame. But thank you. This has been fantastic. I learned a bunch. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.